This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ford. Thanks, IHMC. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. This is my fourth talk in 8 days, so that means two things. One, I'm losing my voice, and two, I've seen every slide that bores the heck out of the crowd. So I will skip over those because I'm tired of looking at people falling asleep as I stare at them. So, all right. My talk, Cancer Prevention Through Dietary Manipulation, Tangible Takeaways. I've given similar talks in the past, and afterwards people have emailed me or called me saying, great talk, but what the heck do I do? So this is going to touch on some of that, but really try to give us takeaways at the end here on how we can decrease our risk of cancer. Excuse me. Little housekeeping. These are recommendations to reduce the risk of cancer. Okay, these are not foolproof. You can do everything right in the world and still come up with cancer. I see this all the time with patients. It's terrible. You can do everything right and still get cancer. We don't have all the answers. So these are just recommendations to maximize that. This is what I do personally. This is what I recommend to my patients. Conversely, if I deal with a lot of cancer patients, it doesn't mean something was done wrong. Okay, we all have our vices, et cetera, so this is a no judgment zone. So disclosure, as Ken brought up, I started the Cancer Prevention Project. Some of my research is funded by Misfit activity trackers, and I don't get paid anything for that. And as Ken said, I have this book, and one disclosure, the book doesn't key in on as much what I'm talking about tonight. So if you go and buy it, great. But if you expect it to be similar to what I'm talking about tonight, you might be disappointed. So I just wanted to throw that out there. What I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to go through the history of diet and cancer and how that led to current recommendations. I'm going to tell us all how I deal with dietary, or the dietary study minefield, as I call it. And we're going to go through some epidemiology studies. And then I'll go through some of the cellular mechanisms on how diet impacts cancer. I'll try to keep that pretty brief. That seems to be the most boring part of the presentation. And then I'll try to give everyone some tangible takeaways. And I'll try to leave some time here for questions afterwards. So this is Richard Dahl, Sir Richard Dahl. And does anyone know what he did? So he's an epidemiologist, kind of the Greek god of epidemiology. He's the first person to show that smoking was strongly associated with lung cancer. When I say strongly associated, I mean heavy smokers had a 3,000 to 4,000 times increased risk of cancer. Okay, so very, very, very strong association. Hazard ratio, you have to know exactly what that is, was 30 or more. So keep that in mind, 30 or more. That's a powerful number. 3,000 times increased risk. Shortly after he showed that association, he went around the world with another guy, Dr. Armstrong, looked at environmental factors at different countries around the globe and looked at other associations. So what dietary associations or what dietary habits were associated with cancer. Three major ones stuck out. He found that people that ate fish, mostly in Asia, had a higher rate of stomach cancer. Okay, it's not from the fish, it's actually from preservation techniques, but nonetheless, he saw that. He found that people who drank a lot of coffee had an increased risk of kidney cancer. People who drank a lot of coffee in third world countries did a lot of other bad things, but nonetheless, he showed that coffee may be associated with kidney cancer. And finally, he found that dietary fat consumption was associated with breast cancer. Now, this is Dahl, who just showed one of the most powerful studies in the world. He pretty much changed the face of medicine forever and public health forever. Now he's linking these three things. So it's not surprising that third one, and we're going to key on that because that's still pretty prevalent throughout the medical literature, or at least the media. Does dietary fat does it cause breast cancer? It's one thing that it's associated with it. Does it cause it? So Walter Willett, who's a Frederick Stare professor at Harvard, he runs their nutrition school. He looked at this in 1987. So 12 years after Dahl's initial study, he wanted to do it in a more robust database. So he had 90,000 nurses. He had them fill out dietary questionnaires. They were aged 34 to 59 with no history of cancer. He saw how much total fat they were eating, saturated fat, linoleic acid, which is polyunsaturated fat, and cholesterol. And he wanted to see how these correlated with their risk of breast cancer. What Dr. Willett found, which he published in the New England Journal of Medicine, was that women that ate more fat had an 18% reduced risk of breast cancer. That thing to the right there, those numbers, it crosses 1. That means it was not statistically significant, but it was pretty darn close. He found that women that ate more saturated fat had a 16% reduced risk of breast cancer. Again, not significant, but close. Women who ate more linoleic acid, now it starts to drop off and really become less statistically significant, but they had a 12% reduced risk of breast cancer and 9% reduced risk for cholesterol. None of this was statistically significant, and this is only an epidemiologic study, so we can't make any strong conclusions. However, the conclusion Willett made was that these data are based on a limited period of follow-up, so these women weren't followed long enough, and do not exclude a possible influence of fat intake before adulthood or at levels lower than 30% of calories. So the women, maybe they weren't eating low enough fat. This was a standard American diet at the time. They suggest, however, that a moderate reduction in fat intake by adult women is unlikely to result in a substantial reduction in incidence of breast cancer. That last sentence, if that confused you, you're not alone. I literally read that 5 times because you saw what happened, and now what they're saying is drastically different. And I get it because, again, we just said Dahl, the god of epidemiology, just showed there might be an association. So it's understandable that the bias was favoring that. About a decade later, 1996, Willett and his team pooled 6 studies, so almost 350,000 women, followed them until there was almost 5,000 cases of breast cancer. And again, no association was found between dietary fat intake and risk of breast cancer. Willett updated his database. He included fiber this time around. In 1992, he found no effect of fat or fiber in the diet on breast cancer incidence. His conclusion, these data provide evidence against both an adverse influence of fat intake and a protective effect of fiber consumption by middle-aged women on breast cancer incidence over 8 years. Nevertheless, the positive association between intake of animal fat and risk of colon cancer observed in many studies provides ample reason to limit this source of energy. So that last sentence was met with a lot of controversy because that's called a straw man argument. That has nothing to do with the data he's looking at. And colon cancer and animal fat is correlated in a lot of studies, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Much like fish was correlated with stomach cancer in Asia, it wasn't actually the fish. There's some, when you cook meat, when you burn it, it can lead to colon cancer, or at least can be associated with colon cancer. That's a whole nother lecture. 1999, we finally have 14 years of follow-up. So if you remember initially, he said maybe it wasn't long enough, maybe women weren't reducing their fat enough. Well, he got both now. He got 14 years. He got less than 20% dietary fat in a lot of these women. You have to remember this was after decades of aggressive low-fat dietary advice. The data still showed no benefit in reducing breast cancer risk with substantial fat avoidance. And as he says, we found no evidence that lower intake of total fat or specific major types of fat was associated with a decreased risk of breast cancer. Again, if you look back through what his results actually showed, fat consumption again trended with lower risk. That was statistically significant. Again, it just trended. And when he assessed fat versus carbohydrate consumption, which this is all kind of silly because no one eats fat by itself and no one eats carbohydrates by itself, and it kind of shows how silly a lot of these studies are. Women that replaced their carbohydrate consumption with fat, so they swapped out 5% of carbs for fat, decreased the risk of breast cancer by 4%, and this was statistically significant. So again, all his data has hinted that lower fat may not only not decrease risk of breast cancer, it might increase that risk. Yet, if you see his conclusions, there's very clear bias here. And again, I don't mean to beat up on Willett so much. And he's vindicated. So he knew the bias was present, and he's commented on it. In 2012, at his cancer prevention lecture at the NCI, he said there was never any strong evidence for this idea, but it was repeated so often that it became dogma in the 1980s and 90s. I would say it's still dogma in a lot of places. Yeah. So countering this, moving a couple decades ahead, and I talked about this actually in my last IHMC study. I'm a radiation oncologist. I see patients quite frequently throughout their treatment. For instance, men with prostate cancer can receive treatment for over an 8-week period. I see them once a week. We talk a lot, and we usually don't talk a lot about their treatment. We talk a lot about other stuff. 2 of the 3 most common questions they ask me is, can I drink wine? The answer is usually yes. And what should I eat? So we didn't really know what to tell people what they should eat. So we asked people where they were going for this information because they sure as heck weren't getting it from their physicians. So lo and behold, they're going to the internet. No surprise, even 4 years ago when we started this study. So what we did was we went to the NCCN. These are the creme de la creme of cancer institutions. We went to their websites to see what they were telling people. Only 4 of the 22 even were making recommendations, and then another 4 were outsourcing these to personal websites. We quantified the recommendations they were giving to people, and this is what we came up with. Blue is carbohydrates, orange is proteins, and the white is fats. As you can see, they're all over the place. Number 1 and 2 is Harvard and MGH, and they made very Willett-like recommendations. This is what will be considered a cardiac prudent diet, and that's controversial, and you'll discuss that with Dr. Diamond in a couple weeks. The far right, this was on the West Coast. This was a higher fat diet, a higher calorie diet, and this is traditionally when people go through cancer treatment, if they lose weight, it's a bad prognostic factor. So we're telling them just eat whatever you can, eat a lot of calories, just don't lose weight. And then in between was just kind of all over the map. So we went to publish this. It actually got rejected left and right. People didn't think this was that interesting or important. It eventually got published in Nutrition and Cancer. It came out the same year when we ran this study. Now this is in mice. These were mice that were injected with breast tumors. You see in the middle there, it says palpable tumor. We waited till those cells grew and the mice actually had breast cancer. And then we randomized these mice. So half of the mice got 8 gray of radiation. This is not a curative dose, but it's enough to slow the growth of these breast tumors. And then there was 3 different groups of the mice. A third of the mice ate an ad libitum diet. This is a diet that basically, in Latin, it means to one's pleasure. They eat as much as they want. Alternate daily fast. The mice fast one day, and then they eat as much as they want the next day, and they never really make up those calories the next day. Then a calorie-restricted diet, this is 30% decrease overall in how many calories the mice are fed. What we found is the mice that ate as much as they wanted, the tumor volume, this is the size, this is the days, quickly grew very large. We gave them an 8 gray shot of radiation, the tumors grew more slowly. Not as slow as mice that actually had their diet restricted by 30%. So in this instance, calorie restriction was a little better than radiation, again, not a curative dose, and they worked synergistically together. So no difference at all besides the diet of these mice, and it significantly slows tumor growth. We did the same thing with alternate daily fasts, and the nice thing about this is the mice initially lose weight and they catch right back up. So if this were a head and neck or a lung cancer patients whom we don't want to lose weight, this might be a way to make the radiation work better. So make them fast every other day. I know, easier said than done. Across the country in Arizona, Dr. Scheck was doing a similar study, and this was with a ketogenic diet. So this is a very low carbohydrate, a very high fat diet, not necessarily calorically restricted, though it often is. And what she did was she gave mice very lethal brain tumors, so lethal that if you do nothing, the majority die in 30 days. She put them on a very low carbohydrate, very high fat ketogenic diet. The mice lived longer. She took 22 more mice, did the same thing, except gave them a curative dose of radiation. The mice that just got radiation lived a lot longer, 150 days, which we know radiation works to extend life in brain tumor patients. When she put them on a ketogenic diet, 9 of the 11 mice, when they were euthanized at 250 days, had no more tumor left in their brain, so 9 of 11 were, in theory, cured. So this was through diet alone. Again, this is in mice, so we have to keep that in mind. Mice are very different. They eat a very high carbohydrate diet. They eat all night long and they sleep during the day. So I want to say they're opposites, but they're probably not opposites of everyone. So Rainer Clement, who's a radiation physicist and a close buddy of mine from Germany, we went through all the animal data and did what's called a meta-analysis. Now these have some issues, but basically meta-analysis is when you take a bunch of studies, combine all their data together, like what Willett did. So instead of a 10 mouse study, you have a several hundred mouse study. And what we found was anything to the left of, remember that hazard ratio thing? If it's high, if it's positive, it's bad. If it's less than 1, it's good. So overall, there's about a 30% benefit in being on a ketogenic diet if you're a mouse with cancer, if you were getting chemotherapy or radiation. So it potentiated the treatment. However, there were some that were not positive, and what we did find was if the diet was implemented before the tumor was actually implanted, it worked a lot better. It also slowed the ability of the tumors to implant. So what we really started to see was yes, it might synergize with treatment. Ketogenic diet does not treat by itself, but if you start it before the cancer happens, it actually may decrease the risk of that cancer happening. So, or as we put it, if the timing of the ketogenic diet is of major importance, this would imply a role of fasting and ketogenic diets as a prevention strategy in humans, but only as a supportive role during cancer treatment, which is consistent with the current available human data, and further studies in humans to test these hypotheses are warranted, and these are taking place now. But again, the point of this is the data really started to favor something about prevention as opposed to treatment. And now going back 100 years, a lot of the reviewers that rejected that paper that I told you about, dietary recommendations, a lot of physician scientists responded saying there's no data at all to support any role of diet in cancer. So I always like to point out this study from 1909, which apparently they never read. But this is the first published study showing the influence of diet on cancer that I know of. It's from 1909. It's Dr. Marashi. What he did was take 4 different groups of mice. He put them on 4 different diets. The fourth diet is ad libitum. So again, the mice ate as much as they wanted. And then each step down, the mice were calorically restricted. So similar to our study with the breast tumor model in mice, he calorically restricted them. Then he implanted a sarcoma. Sarcoma is a soft tissue cancer. It grows along muscles and bones. It's easy to palpate. So easy to do experiments on when it's 1909 and you don't have a lot of laboratory equipment. What he showed was that as the mice were more and more calorically restricted, the tumors grew smaller and smaller and smaller. So first study showing, again, over 100 years ago, if you simply calorically restrict the mice, tumors grow much slower. One criticism of this is those mice lost a lot more weight, the calorically restricted mice. So perhaps everything was just smaller. Again, it's tough to say. It was 1909. 4 years later, Eleanor Van Alstine and S.P. Beebe ran a study. It's the largest mouse study to date. It's 303 mice. It has not been surpassed as of 103 years. And they exposed mice to different diets, exposed them to different carcinogen and tumor models. They found something similar. As they put it, there seems to be no reasonable ground for doubt in view of these experiments that a lack of carbohydrate in the diet produces such an influence upon the rats as to make them more resistant to tumor growth. When the diet includes carbohydrate, the tumors grow luxuriantly. When the diet does not include carbohydrate, the animals show a marked resistance. This study was met with a lot of controversy as well. But again, strong data showing there's something about carbohydrates that can promote cancer growth. This is not different from Willett's data, even though there's some issues, of course, with those studies. A lot of people quote the benefits of a ketogenic diet as support from ecological studies, and ecologic studies they're always the most interesting but least scientific, but I still like them. J. A. Orcaheart was a surgeon in northern Canada, and he worked with the Inuits. A lot of the Inuits had appendicitis, so he'd remove their appendix. He had x-rays. He had all the modern equipment that everyone else in the world had, yet he was not finding cancer in these Eskimos. They eat mostly whale blubber, a ketogenic diet, a very high-fat diet, and that's why people think they maybe had such a low rate of cancer. As he put it, as regards cancer, I've not in my 7 years experience in the North seen a single case of malignancy in either Eskimo or Indian. As for the hospitals, the natives appreciate them to the utmost and use them freely. It's for someone else to explain this absence of cancer amongst these people. That was 1935, and we're explaining the absence of cancer amongst these people right now. So Tannenbaum, over the next 50 years, he ran by far the most in-depth studies looking at different cancer and tumor models. He took the criticisms of Marashi and he weighed the mice incessantly. One of his colleagues, who I was lucky enough to work with, said they would all poke at him and make fun of him because he was just playing with mice like 24 hours a day. And he looked at more from a preventative strategy. He took spontaneous breast tumors from mice that were genetically modified to basically be at very high risk of having a breast cancer. He induced skin tumors by painting a tar and DMBA on their skin. These are harsh studies. And the mice would develop skin cancer. He would induce sarcomas like Marashi, primary lung tumors, and leukemia. And what he found was that uniformly, if you calorically restricted the mice anywhere from 30 to 50%, the amount of tumors that they would spontaneously develop decreased significantly. So that's a first. There's something about calorie restriction in these mice that decreases cancer. One thing to remember is these mice were sitting in a crate all day. They're generally overfed. These are not the same as a mouse in the wild. These are like your cubicle mice that kind of graze all day, which is not different than most Americans, unfortunately. But nonetheless, it's an important point to make. So really, when you dig deeper in his work, you find two things. The red line there, those are the biggest reduction in cancers. Those were the studies when he restricted carbohydrates. And he commented on there's something about, much like Van Alstine and Beebe, if you restrict carbohydrates, it significantly decreases cancer growth. The other thing he found was they talk about this high-fat diet, a high-fat diet increasing cancer. If you look at it, it's a very high-fat polyunsaturated diet. So corn oil, if you give mice a lot of corn oil, they do get high rates of cancer. So if you restrict that, they get lower rates. So polyunsaturated fats and carbohydrates really stand out in these mice studies. I'm going to skip through. These were my boring slides. So I don't need to go too deep into this because you're going to get a lecture on this in the next couple weeks. But at this point, the crowd is usually thinking, what's this quack up there telling me to do? Eat a lot of fat? Aren't my arteries going to clog? Ironically, the same year that Beebe and Van Alstine published the largest mouse study ever, this study was published, and this started the lipid hypothesis. This is from a niche cow in Russia. He wasn't using mice. He was using rabbits. As bad as mice are, rabbits are worse. They do not eat any meat at all. They eat a vegetarian diet. He gave them a bunch of cholesterol. It clogged their arteries. This guy, a couple decades later, Ansel Keys, looked at 22 countries, published 8 of them, showing that a higher fat diet may increase coronary artery disease, also showed that a higher carbohydrate diet might do it too. And that's kind of the joke of our nutritional recommendations. They're basically based on studies that wouldn't even make it through the peer review process nowadays. So we're going back to these pretty poor studies, and it's almost like throw a dart. What was someone eating? That could be your dietary recommendations, which is why I love the Rosetta story. I don't know if anyone's heard. Rosetta's a town in Pennsylvania. It's a little bit north of Philadelphia. It's Italian immigrants from Rosetta in southern Italy. They came over. They lived north of Philly. They were very socially cohesive. They smoked a lot. They drank a lot of homemade wine. They ate a lot of prosciutto. And they worked in the slate mines. So it was backbreaking work. And Dr. Brun and Dr. Wolf went in to study them because rumors were going around that they had very, very, very low rates of coronary artery disease. They studied them, and it was true. Even though they did everything wrong, they rarely had heart attacks. They've published it in JAMA. They published it in New England Journal of Medicine. And they thought it was because of the social cohesiveness. They thought it had nothing to do with the food. So unfortunately, they didn't go there. We could all just be drinking, smoking, and eating prosciutto and not having heart disease. The other kind of silliness of these studies, these ecological / epidemiologic studies, I'm Southern Italian. My last name's actually Ciampetti. And my grandma, who's 96 and still alive, talks about like the golden era when they ate with lard and all the fat was pouring out of the faucets and everyone was healthy. And so if you look at the data from Dr. Stout and his group in Rosetta, this is how much lard they were using, olive oil, butter, and 4 more eggs per week. It was like 50 to 60% of households were using these foods a lot. And when the 80s came, they dropped significantly because that's what they were told to do for several decades, right? That's why my grandma stopped eating Brussels sprouts because she couldn't cook them in butter anymore. The funny thing is their cholesterol went up in the 80s, and their coronary artery disease risk is exactly the same as everyone else. So there's clearly a lot more going on here. So epidemiology. So I like this quote: "Our main business of life is not to see what lies dimly at a distance, but to do what lies clearly at hand." So I want to convince you that epidemiologic studies are viewing what lies dimly at a distance, whereas more advanced studies are what lies clearly at hand. And to do that, I want to bring up this study. And a lot of you might be indirectly familiar with this. This is a prospective study on postmenopausal estrogen therapy and coronary heart disease. This is by Willett and his group from Harvard, published in 1985. Remember those nurses that he looked at for breast cancer? He looked at them also for how many were using hormone replacement therapy. 122,000 nurses. They adjusted for a ton of different things. So tobacco, diabetes, hypertension, cholesterol levels, parental MI, oral contraceptives, obesity. And what they found was regardless of adjusting for all those factors, women that were using hormone replacement therapy currently had a 70% decreased risk of coronary artery disease, and women who used them in the past had a 50% decreased risk of coronary artery disease. So as a result, we prescribed these for a lot of postmenopausal women for decades. When we actually ran a randomized controlled trial, which was published several decades later in 2002, where we took a large group of women, gave half of them hormone replacement therapy, gave half of them a placebo, what we found was that the hormones increased the risk of heart disease by 30%, increased the risk of breast cancer by 26%, stroke by 40%, a blood clot in the lungs by 113%. Total cardiovascular disease went up by 22%. The only benefit, because estrogen helps to strengthen bones, was it decreased the risk of hip fracture. So what's the lesson here about associations? So these were the women that were asking for hormone replacement therapy. And I see these patients, they come from the gym, they're wearing Lululemon. I see them for their visit, they leave and go back to the gym. They eat their green smoothie at home. These were like the most healthy women around who, when they went through menopause, they couldn't deal with the hot flashes. They wanted to be exercising, they followed directions, they ate well, they did everything right, so they were asking their doctors for hormone replacement therapy. So all we did was show an association between wearing Lululemon and, no, it was women that were more proactive. And so the key here is these type of studies come out every day. The news, every day, strawberries are going to cause cancer, cure you from cancer, coffee, etc. Keep this in mind every time the local news scares you to death. These studies come out all the time. And until you do a randomized trial or at least get some more significant studies, you can't really believe it. So I always ask myself, are the recommendations backed by population data, mechanistic support, animal data, and randomized human data? And yes, and I don't even think Mark Twain actually said this, but he's always quoted, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Even that study from Dahl back in 1975, if you read through the conclusions, it's a long study. I don't suggest you do it, but he said the associations and findings may reflect some other variable correlated with economic development. Again, who in Southeast Asia is drinking a lot of coffee? The westernized people. They're also smoking. They're also doing a lot of other bad things that we do. The quality of cancer incidence data is significantly affected by economic factors, particularly as controlling for any of the food consumption variables can reduce this correlation. So Dahl knew back in 75, when you look at food, it's really, really difficult, and he warned us of it. And he cautioned specifically that the association between breast cancer and obesity makes further calculations difficult. People that were eating more fat were also more obese. We know that obesity correlates with cancer. And if I haven't convinced you yet, this is a study from another radiation oncologist, Dr. Schoenfield, with Dr. Ioannidis. They're in Harvard, and they went through the Boston cookbook, which is apparently a famous cookbook. They looked at all the ingredients in the cookbook and basically went through every epidemiologic study on those foods and found that basically every food can cure you or cause cancer. So, I mean, even onions are causing cancer. Lemons are causing cancer. My favorite is, where is wine? Did you guys see wine at the top? Yeah, wine is mostly positive, so that's what I took from this. And that's the joke of this all. You can take whatever you want. Further illustrating this, and we have a paper coming out soon on this, is what is a food? You know, saying you eat cheese, there's a lot of different cheese. Saying you eat eggs, there's a lot of different eggs. And this is a study where people were given traditional eggs where the chickens are kind of crowded, they're fed grains, they're very stressed out, they live a pretty horrendous life. Or you have chickens where you feed them omega-3 rich foods. People ate the two different types of chickens. They did lab work on them, and they tested their erythrocytes, the membranes of their erythrocytes, to see if the fats in them was different based on what the chickens were fed. And they found that they were significantly different. This is a percentage change from what the chickens were eating. Significantly higher amounts of anti-inflammatory omega-3, alpha-linoleic acid, DHA. So how can you believe a study saying that eggs are bad or good when it matters what egg you're actually eating? So I always stress this to my patients and myself. It depends on what you're eating. So what tangible dietary recommendations can we give patients to help prevent cancer diagnosis and recurrence. Does anyone know where this is? It is very close. Capri's to the right there. You can't see it. But yeah, this is Ravello. And when I like Italy, I go there a lot. I like Alianico wine, which is what this is, very high in antioxidants. So I go to the restaurant and say, just give me what you got, whatever you think I'll like. And this is what they brought out. So this is a Mediterranean diet. This is another thing you hear about on the news all the time. People promote a Mediterranean diet. Nobody knows what it is. Prosciutto, cantaloupe. This is like a Rosetta type diet. And then this is my favorite. It's buffalo mozzarella and tomatoes. Buffalo mozzarella is a great example. This is from buffalo and pastum that roam the fields. They eat grass. And even the fatty acid profile of that cheese is extremely different than mozzarella made from cows fed corn and stuffed in a pen. This is a close-up of, isn't that amazing? So I'll keep this one brief. This is a boring one, but I can't skip it. So what was going on in those initial studies with Tannenbaum, with with Marashi, even our breast cancer study in the mice, we were feeding these mice almost 100% carbohydrate diet. So we're actually carbohydrate restricting them as well. You can call it calorie restriction, but it becomes semantics at some point. What was likely happening is they were decreasing these three things. So when you eat a lot of carbohydrates, your body breaks it down to sugar. Sugar goes into your blood. Too much sugar in your blood is toxic. You have a very fine line of too high sugar, too low sugar. As a result, your pancreas spits out insulin. It pulls it from your blood and into your cells. That's what saves us. That's what stops it from being fatal. Unfortunately, if you have too much of this, you get too much of this. You also get too much of that, but that's a different talk for another day. And that can activate these pathways. And what these pathways do is increase cancer cell survival, cell growth, and they also increase inflammation, which is basically like the fertilizer for cancer cells. So you decrease these, you decrease this. Could be another talk for another day, but antagonistic to this all is this guy, AMP kinase. This is upregulated during times of scarcity. So you eat too much, you upregulate these. You don't eat enough, you upregulate this, which blocks these, okay? Things that upregulate this: exercise, intense exercise, severe carbohydrate restriction, a ketogenic diet, fasting, all these types of things that tell your body that, hey, there's not a lot of stuff going around. We need to break down our cells. If there's any faulty parts, we need to break them down and recycle them. If there's any cells that have damage that could possibly turn cancerous, we need to break them down as well. Even if you look back at our data back in 2013, those mice that were calorically restricted, that were given radiation and that were done both together, all those receptors that I mentioned decreased. So this just means how much it was expressed. They all decreased. So why is this important? This is risk of prostate cancer, which is, besides skin cancer, is the most common cancer in men. And men that have a serum insulin greater than 6.1 have almost 300% higher risk of having prostate cancer. And again, this is a population study, so there's issues. But if you have more insulin floating around, you're upregulating this more than you should, and you're getting a higher risk of prostate cancer. So what do we tell people to do? And in cancer patients, we don't have this data, right? It's a tough group of patients. These are expensive studies. Luckily, we do have some data in non-cancer patients. This is a study where they took a group of people, calorically restricted them on a roughly standard American diet, and then put them on 3 different diets: a low-fat diet, a low glycemic index diet, so carbs that don't spike your blood sugar as much, and a very low-carb diet, which I'd say it's low-carb. I don't think that's very low-carb. And they made them eat the same calories, and they all lost weight, as we'd expect, because they restricted them. But however, when you took their blood and looked at what was actually happening, so HDL in the low-fat dieters went down significantly. This is our good, fluffy, Nerf-like cholesterol that takes bad cholesterol out and brings it back to our liver. Triglycerides, which are very bad, dropped in all of them. But again, you'll see the biggest drop in the low-carb diet. You'll see the biggest rise in the good cholesterol in the low-carb diet. And that's fine and dandy. But for our purposes here, insulin sensitivity. So how sensitive are your cells to insulin? And by that I mean, will a little amount of insulin get rid of your blood sugar? Or has your pancreas been hammered so hard you need to secrete a lot of insulin to get rid of that blood sugar? What they found was both hepatic in the liver and peripheral insulin sensitivity went up significantly in that low-carb diet. Not too shabby as well in the low GI diet. The low-fat diet wasn't so hot. So we can take that data, and I do tell my patients, if we're trying to decrease insulin and we put you on a diet like that, it will decrease, as will blood glucose. This is a study from, actually, Dahl wrote this up, but this was Jeff Volek, who I think spoke here a couple years ago. When he puts people on these very low carbohydrate, very high fat ketogenic diets, tells them they can eat as much as they want, or compares them with people on a low fat diet and says you can't eat more than 1,500 calories. The low carb dieters eat less. So that might be part of the benefit. But if you're eating a high-fat diet, you're generally satiated a lot more. You don't crave things, right? It's not that bowl of oatmeal in the morning that everyone doctor tells them to eat, and you eat at 8 o'clock and you're hungry again at 10. Okay, you're more satiated. These were not the healthiest group of people, but their circulating sugar dropped by 15%. Their circulating insulin dropped by 50%. So if we know that insulin's fueling those pathways, don't we want it to be low? So what I tell my patients and what I do myself is eat less simple carbs or things that stimulate glucose. And eat less often. If you're eating all day long, your blood sugar's staying up there, your insulin level's staying up there. We want it to drop off and stay low like it did a million years ago when we didn't have food every hour, every 2 hours. Limit foods that stimulate those three things, glucose, insulin, IGF. So sugar, pasta, bread, modern grains. If you exercise a lot, eat carbohydrate foods around exercise time. You're more insulin sensitive. And also I tell people not to overconsume protein. So I don't have time to get into this, but too much protein can activate those same pathways. The lean meats movement has to stop. Even protein supplements, there's no reason to go nuts on them. And I'm going to skip through that. So the next question is, what about weight? What do we tell people about losing weight? You're telling us to eat this high-fat diet. Aren't we going to gain weight? So we know that women after menopause, back to that initial nurses study, anything to the left of this is weight loss. So women that lose 10 pounds after menopause, their risk of breast cancer drops by 30%. Women that gain 10 pounds after menopause, the risk of breast cancer goes up by 30%. Women that gain 10 pounds of weight after being treated with radiation or chemotherapy for breast cancer, their risk of recurrence goes up by 30%. So we want people to not have excess fat tissue. It secretes hormones. It secretes estrogen. Estrogen can feed cancer cells. So we all have to turn to this guy, and I'll keep this brief here, but this is our mitochondria. Okay, these are the powerhouses of our cells. If you break down sugar, eventually it gets kicked into there. Interestingly enough, alcohol and cancer kind of runs on sugar as well, but that's a whole other talk. If you break down proteins, amino acids, fats, they get a quicker hop into there. And as they go around the Krebs cycle, they make these things called ATP, all right? Those are our energy sources. If you're overloading the system and this is going nuts, there's this thing over here that makes free radicals. Free radicals are bad, right? Antioxidants offset free radicals. If it makes too much of that, it's like an engine in overdrive. It's going to shut down your cell. So if you're eating too much, regardless of what it is, carbs, fat, protein, whatever, your cells are going to start shutting down, and they're going to stop taking up that glucose. So when your pancreas says, let's get rid of the glucose, and a bunch of your cells are saying, no, we're shut down now, that glucose is going to float out in your body and cause more insulin stimulation. Furthermore, when we overload our cells, it stresses the machinery, the mitochondria become fragmented, these protons start pouring out, and again, more and more free radicals are made. Free radicals can treat cancer, but they're very dangerous and they can cause cancer. So what I tell my patients is focus on good stress versus bad stress. The key here is not necessarily, eating less, exercising more. It's stressing our body in a healthy way. So fasting, exercise, periodic ketosis, some people full-time ketosis, acute stress like lifting heavy weights. These things tell our cells, oh boy, we're running from a prey here, we might go down, or we're out of food, we're not going to have any food for 2 weeks. So you start breaking down the extra junk. If you're constantly eating too many calories, if you have obesity, if you have diabetes, you're telling the cells the exact opposite. You're saying there's energy all over the place, go ahead and grow, we don't really care. And it also causes, as we just said, mitochondrial dysfunction. So do we tell people to exercise more and eat less, which is, I think, maybe the worst advice you can give anyone, because this is what happens. Steve Finney did a study where he calorically restricted people to 700 calories and watched, yeah, that's really, really low, and watched their metabolism drop by 10%. He then made them exercise and watched their metabolism drop by almost 30%. This is why everyone feels like crap when they eat less and try to exercise more, and within a week, everyone fails. So the question is then, we need to eat foods that allow us to eat less and to exercise more, okay? And again, if you look at, these are the first 26 studies. This is from Chris Gunners. I stole it from his website. But a low-carb diet has never been worse than a low-fat diet for weight loss, even when you tell people that they can eat as much as they want. And usually it's a lot better. And even Walter Willett, our buddy Walter Willett, said in that same lecture, there's absolutely no impact of a low-fat diet on weight loss at 1 year, as confirmed by many studies. And the overall evidence suggests more that low-fat diets are less successful in maintaining weight loss. So even Willett's saying this, which was pretty heroic of him because it's very different than the data he was producing. So if we look back at that study where we put the groups on 3 different diets, low-fat, high-fat, and low GI, when you calorically restrict people, everyone's energy drops. So anything below here is your resting energy expenditure. This is total energy expenditure. One thing that stands out is these people's energy changes all over the map. This is why some people can calorically restrict and still go to the gym and not have an issue. These people, it's getting pretty miserable, right? Negative 800. However, if you look, the average drop in metabolism was 400 on a low-fat diet, a little bit better on a low GI diet, but not much better, significantly better on a low-fat diet. This is why people can continue to lose weight. This is why you can eat less, still feel satiated, and still have enough energy to go on with your day without giving up after a week. Finally, these are 2 different stigma scores. It's a psychiatric study. What we also found is the more we pester people to exercise, the more they want exercise. So this is your risk of not exercising if you feel stigmatized by your doctor. So if I pester you to exercise, you're certainly not going to exercise. So I need to give you the goals to be able to exercise. I can't simply just say, hey, exercise. I need to tell you what diet to eat that will give you the energy to exercise. So what I tell my patients and what I do myself is I eat foods that allow me or my patients to eat less, allow us to exercise more, and I eat nutrient-dense and vitamin-rich foods. That's why we're eating. We're eating for nutrients and we're eating for vitamins, and we're also eating for some energy. Avoid foods that stimulate appetite and avoid empty foods. So you want foods that give you more bang for your buck. So know yourself. If almonds make you eat the entire jar, then don't buy almonds anymore. And I actually can't buy almonds anymore. And my last one is decrease oxidative damage. So that last thing I mentioned, the mitochondria, when they're pumping away, they make free radicals. Free radicals damage our cells and can make them cancerous. Instead, I tell people to replace them with foods that fight inflammation and foods that fight free radicals, also foods that feed our microbiome. That's an anti-inflammatory. That's a whole nother talk. Brussels sprouts, cruciferous vegetables, these have sulfur. It stresses our cells. It's basically like dress rehearsal for battle. It thinks it's a toxin. It's really not. It makes our immune cells fight better so that when cancer actually comes, it can help us to fight it in real battle. Spices seem to do the same thing. It upregulates our immune cells. And then if you're going to turn towards carbohydrate sources, obviously green carbohydrates, leafy things, it's hard to eat too much. Berries, fibrous fruits, they feed our bowels, they feed our bowel bacteria, they enhance our immune system, raspberries, blueberries, etc. And I'm going to quickly wrap this up here. Quick lesson in organic chemistry. So keep in mind that not all fats are the same. So this guy's obviously been hit pretty hard over the past several decades. But what makes a saturated fat is that all of those carbons in the backbone are saturated with hydrogens. That's why at room temperature, butter is solid. It's saturated, it's very stable. Monounsaturated fats have one of those bonds unsaturated, monounsaturated, okay? That is one place where free radicals can go and attack, okay? This is why when you heat with unsaturated oils, they start to brown, whereas you can take ghee or some of these more stable fats and cook with them and they don't brown. Polyunsaturated has many sites on it that are unsaturated, many places for free radicals to bind, many places for that corn oil and Roos's studies to have free radicals that are implemented into the mice and thus increase the risk of cancer. We actually have a randomized study from 1971 where we gave men corn oil to reduce the risk of coronary artery disease. And it actually did slightly, and there's a couple issues with that. It was laced with vitamin E. But what we found was these are rates of cancer deaths by each diet. And as you can see here, this is significantly higher. This is the experimental diet. So this is a diet we were giving people to reduce their risk of dying. It was increasing the risk of having cancer significantly. There was no difference in overall deaths, but when the study stopped at 7 years, which is not long enough for a dietary study, these curves really start to split. The controlled diet starts to flatline, the experimental diet falls off significantly, with 50% of participants already dead. So keep that in mind when you think about vegetable oils. I tell no one to eat any vegetable oils, and certainly do not cook with vegetable oils because you're basically imparting them with free radicals. Instead, turn towards sources of fat that have free radical fighting capabilities, like vitamin E, vitamin A, and beta-carotene. So Alberta butter, so these are cows that roam around eating grass, much like our egg study and other studies, have significantly higher amounts of all three of these. So these are cancer-fighting nutrients. Conjugated linoleic acid, which is a fat that helps fight breast cancer, is basically proportionate to the amount of pasture that cows graze on. Here's grain and hay, third pasture, two-thirds pasture, 100% pasture, has significant higher amounts of conjugated linoleic acid. So if you're not going to eat carbs, we don't want you to overload on protein. You got to eat something. So if you're going to eat fat, let's make sure it's the right fats. Omega-3s, those anti-inflammatory omega-3s, vanish proportional to the amount of time that cows are grain-fed. By 196 days, they're almost gone. So this meat and this meat are not the same. And then 100% pasture beef creates the ideal essential fatty acid balance. So when we were hunter-gatherers, we had about 1-to-1 ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. When you feed these cows pasture, it goes up a lot higher, and those are the inflammatory omega-6s. So my final recommendations here, and I'm running over, I don't tell patients to eat less. I tell them to eat foods that allow them to eat less. I tell them to eat those foods that are more satiating, and then we'll work it out after the fact. I tell them to eat nutrient-dense, vitamin-rich foods, ones that decrease blood glucose, insulin, IGF, inflammation. Stress appropriately. Avoid oxidative free radical damage. Increase your body's ability to fight that free radical damage. Increase those dress rehearsals by fasting, by eating spices, by eating cruciferous vegetables. And finally, question research or even ignore epidemiologic studies, because if you rely on them, this is what you're going to end up with, recommendations all over the place. So thank you very much. Any questions? Sure.
I have a question for you. The way that I understand milk works, that once that you heat milk up and you what's that called when you pasteurize it, and then you hydrogenize it, there's nothing left in milk that's good for you because it kills all the protein. Now you said milk was leolinic acid, isn't that what you said?
Dairy.
Are you talking about raw milk?
So you're correct. There's a couple things. Your first comment's correct. So yeah, it denatures a bunch of the proteins. It denatures a lot of the benefits. Furthermore, if you eat the benefits in the fats, if you have skim milk, you're basically eating a bunch of denatured nothing. I don't promote milk for anyone. It's a high source of sugar. It's great for things that want to grow, right? Babies want to grow, so you feed them milk. The benefits in dairy is from the fat part of dairy, right? The conjugated linoleic acid is in the fat. The protein in dairy is fine. It's controversial to a degree because of the casein, but the benefits in the fat. So I don't see a huge reason for drinking milk at all.
Okay, and then one more question. You said grass-fed beef increases inflammation.
No, decreases.
Oh, okay. I must have read it wrong.
It increases the amount of omega-3s that are anti-inflammatory.
Okay.
Yeah. Sure. Sorry.
Thank you for a splendid lecture.
Thank you.
Just what if cancer was nature's way of sparing the pancreas and reducing blood sugar? The cancer has 3 times the affinity for blood sugar as the ordinary cell, and high blood sugar will kill you right away, and cancer kills you slowly. So what if cancer is one of the body's defense mechanisms against diabetes?
You should write that up for Scientific American, because that is very, very interesting and very plausible. Oh, sorry, he was next. Sorry.
I wanted to ask you about metformin. I noticed it on two of your screens, but you never talked about it.
So he asked about metformin. Metformin is a drug that upregulates AMP kinase. So the antagonistic pathway of those things we don't want, like insulin, IGF pathway, it upregulates those things. So I give a similar talk a lot of times, and a lot of like the VC guys out in San Fran, like everyone's taking metformin. So I always question, and I say there's no evidence for it, but that's why. And if for type 2 diabetics, metformin has been shown to be better in terms of cancer as opposed to insulin or other medications. It actually lowers the risk of cancer. So don't call it taking metformin, but it was just kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of, yeah. But that slide put people asleep, so I skipped over it. So, anyone else? Oh, sorry, there's...
Thank you. As I understand, the brain is primarily made up of fat, but it gets its energy from carbohydrates or ketones, correct? And I want
Sugar,
you,
ketones, yeah.
Sure. Explain ketones to me exactly. If I understand it, that's fat metabolized.
Sure. So ketones are basically, if you think about 1,000,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago in the wintertime, there's not a lot of carbohydrates. So your blood sugar starts to drop. You're relying primarily, or we'll take the Inuits, they're relying primarily on fat. So your carbohydrate intake drops, your sugar levels start to drop, okay? As you said, your brain needs a compensatory mechanism to derive energy. So your body starts breaking down its muscle. So you break down amino acids, you break down some other things. Great, but there's a big problem there because your diaphragm, what makes you breathe, and your heart's made of muscle. So if you start breaking that down, you're going to be in big trouble. So instead, you start burning fat, your liver turns it into ketones, and then it feeds your brain, and all's well. So really, it's like an evolutionary compensatory mechanism to offset improper breakdown of our muscles, or it's really just a normal fueling process for our body. So the first comment is what people, I think, used to think. The second comment, I think, is becoming a little more of the normal thought process nowadays. That all make sense? Okay, thanks. Right there.
Please share with us your diet.
Sure. So I'll give you 2 days. I have coffee with grass-fed heavy cream in the morning, and that's my breakfast, and then I'll go to lunch, and I usually have one pastured source of animal, lamb, beef, fish, salmon, cod, squid, and then I'll have a big plate of greens. So like Brussels sprouts cooked in butter, kale. Dinner, I have a similar meal. If I have breakfast as well, I'll have, I make an omelet. So I cook eggs, a lot of eggs. I'm pretty active, so I'll do like 4 to 6 eggs. I'm not saying anyone else should go do that. And then, so there's always some kind of green leafy veggie source, and then I'll sprinkle like sprouts. And then dinner, I usually cook some kind of meat or fish with a lot of spices. And then a glass or 2, sometimes 3, of red wine from Cahors or Alianico, which are my 2 favorites. And that's usually it. On the weekends, I rarely eat breakfast. I usually eat dinner the night before, and then I don't eat again until noon the next day, plus or minus. Yeah. And then, sorry.
First off, thank you for one of the better presentations in terminology that everybody could actually understand and relate to.
Thank you.
I'm not sure about the Freudian implication of your tendency to hang out with people the age of your parents and grandparents, but I'll leave that for another comment. And from what I gather from all the various extreme diets, the conclusion I got from your presentation was they don't necessarily make you live longer, it just maybe makes it feel like it.
But what do you mean by extreme diets?
Over excessive of, like you, what was the thing about the no carb or no fat or no this, as opposed to, shall we say, a little bit of common sense and moderation of everything? Yeah,
I would agree, with one caveat that if we keep carbohydrates generally lower, we get less insulin, we get less blood sugar going up and down. So it makes those periods a lot better. So when I, like for instance, on the weekend, when I fast for 18 hours, it's not really that hard. But I don't eat a lot of carbohydrates. If I tried to do that 10 years ago, it would have been a nightmare for me. So, sorry, with my food, I do eat berries and some fruits as well. So,
time for one more question.
I feel bad. I wasn't looking over this way.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, you said that you shouldn't cook with vegetable oils, but ghee was good. And I want to clarify, is olive oil still good, in your opinion?
Olive oil is good. It's not really I don't consider it a vegetable oil. I don't cook with olive oil high heat, okay?
Right.
So I garnish with it. What I cook with is, ghee, duck fat, lard, macadamia nut oil, avocado oil, coconut oil. Yeah, coconut oil is. But I don't do any high heat cooking because you saw the free radicals in there. Like, it's not good to overheat anything, but if you're going to go on the higher end of the spectrum, ghee is by far one of the better ones.
So that's frying. Frying is high heat.
Yeah, I wouldn't fry anything at high heat. Even in the oven, I would be weary going over 350. Some people say 300.
I just wanted to clarify that because I love olive oil. And I have another question. I'm getting bumped over here and I love dark chocolate too. So what do you think about dark chocolate added into your diet?
I lied to you. I do eat dark chocolate. So 85% or more is the best. Higher fat is better. Higher fiber is better. And I actually make my own. So if you want to make your own, put pepper in it, cayenne pepper, and salt, and try it with no sugar at all. It's not for the weak of heart, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.